I want to now introduce Gianni Cipriano and Salvatore Vitale. I'm very happy that you're both here. My dear friend Gianni, I'm excited that you invited Salvatore. Gianni and I met a long time ago at ICP. I think it was like the day before he dropped off his portfolio to apply to study at ICP. ICP is the International Center of Photography. And Gianni works as a photojournalist and editorial photographer. He works for the New York Times quite frequently, and he creates absolutely wonderful environmental portraits. And he also teaches an environmental portrait lighting class for StrudelmediaLive. He has done it a few times, and Gianni is a great teacher. But I now want to hand it over to Gianni. And he will introduce Salvatore.
So hello, everyone. I've seen some of you that I already know. Some of you are former students of my environmental portraiture class that I taught on Strudel Media. For those who don't know me, well, Anya already introduced me. So yeah, I'm Gianni. I'm a documentary photographer. I'm now based in Italy, and my work is usually published throughout editorial publications, such as the New York Times, for who I work quite frequently here in Italy. So who is Salvatore Vitale? As I said, he is a dear friend of mine that I met, I think, in 2010 or 2011, maybe, during a photography masterclass that I was attending in Lugano. The circumstances of that encounter are quite funny, actually, because we looked at each other for a long time, and during the break, at one point, at the same time, we asked each other, "Are you from Palermo?" which is the capital of Sicily. And eventually, yes, we were both from the same city. We're both Sicilians. And so from that moment, it was just true love. So, and yeah, so it's interesting for me to see how Salvatore has evolved in his career, first as a photographer and now an artist. And I think it's just, the reason why I decided to invite him is because, first of all, I mean, I'm a huge fan of his work, of his approach to this project, How to Secure a Country, which is here in the form of a book. It's also an exhibition, and I absolutely invite you to purchase this book after you've listened to Salvatore. Basically, I mean, Salvatore will go deeply explain you what this work is about, but it's fundamentally about his visual research and him investigating, security measures in contemporary societies. And in this case study, it is about Switzerland, the country where he immigrated after high school. But those are, biographical informations that are relevant to the project and that Salvatore will talk about in just a minute. So yeah, just let's start. I'm going to hand over, the presentation to Salvatore, and I'll just intervene maybe at one point if I have any questions. Let's have this conversation start right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gianni, for this very beautiful introduction, and also for this we have a lot of common memory, actually, because of this long-term friendship, and also we have been discussing a lot about a lot of stuff, but I remember that also we were having a discussion. We were in Rome, I guess, in your apartment there, when I was telling you like the first steps about moving to make this project. So that also feels very special at the moment to talk about it with you now, because some years have gone through in the meantime, but I think, I mean, the motivation that brought me to do this are still very strong and are the same when I was telling you about it at the beginning. I would define myself not fully as a photographer. Maybe, you know, I'm a little bit of a researcher, educator. I'm a publisher because I run a photography magazine, as Gianni was mentioning. So I'm very interested in what is image and what are the implications of images in today's world. So my curiosity brings me to really approach photography in many ways and like under several perspectives. And this is something that in the end then I also put in my works and in the production of my personal projects. And my view is always quite broad. I really like to work. I really like to take my time to do things. That's why I mainly work on long-term projects that sometimes last even years. And this is something that I enjoy a lot because then allows me to put together all these different souls that I have and to put them into one single project in a way. Let's call it like this, even though it's a little bit more complicated, maybe. So my work, of course, I mean, at the very beginning, when I met with Gianni, I was mainly shooting portraits or even fashion photography. I even spent a period in Los Angeles working as a fashion photographer. Of course, soon I understood that that was not really my thing. So at some point I came back to Switzerland and then I was like, well, what should I do now? And this was the moment in which, I mean, actually was one of the most amazing moments in my life, even though I was super depressed. But that was the moment in which I started to define what I really wanted to do. And at the same time, I also started Yet magazine. So that was like a very productive period of my life. And probably, I mean, you know, in many cases, crises bring innovation or in a way, help you to redefine yourself. And then you can see things that maybe you weren't able to see on an earlier stage. So basically, I came back to Switzerland. I started Yet magazine, but this is another story. If you want to know more about it, we can discuss it later, no problem. And I decided to start this online class with Allen Frame at ACP. And actually, I mean, there I understood what I wanted to do, that I wanted to be a documentary photographer. Of course, now I don't even know if I can define myself as a documentary photographer anymore, but I wanted to really be involved into society. Because that has always been an interest for me, like being socially engaged. My dad taught me a lot about how to be engaged and how to try to tell stories that are relevant in order to understand also how this world we live in works. Slowly, of course, then while you work, then I understood that my interest was very much into this concept of, I was interested in society, I was interested in the power structure. Like here you have a list, governmentality, technoscience. I mean, they are all quite abstract in a way, entities. And I'm very interested in understanding how to put into images, into visual matter, something that is highly elusive. It's a challenge, of course, if you're a photographer, but I think it's also quite essential in order to really give somehow an answer to many of the questions that affect all of us every day. So how society works and what are the implications of technology, for instance, in society. And then I will tell you more about it also because it concerns what I'm working on right now. And maybe before I start to show you something, this is my big background as a researcher. Well, my work is never like, I'm not the kind of photographer that goes out with a camera and takes picture and then creates a narrative. I probably work the other way around. I really like to, I study a lot, and then I'm kind of put together like my research and conceptual background, and then I go out and produce only when I know what I need to. At some point I had to really understand what is invisibility, like what is my take on invisibility. And that was very interesting for me because, I mean, after some years of thinking about it, reading about it, you know, at some point I was reading an essay, a scientific paper, and then I found this scholar, Espet van Beren, who basically theorized these four different type of invisibility. And it was like, wow, she's basically saying what I'm thinking, or what I'm kind of, you know, she put into words what I was working on already. And it's important because, of course, I mean, invisibility is very broad. And for instance, in order to understand my work on the Swiss security system, how to secure a country, it's important to understand, for instance, that I've been working on this concept of invisibility as barrier, which basically means invisibility as barrier. It's the kind of invisibility that really affects systems, a security system, for instance. So all these structures, power structures that basically have to stay invisible in order to be efficient and in order to work. Also because the ones that, for instance, in a security system who produce security has an interest that most of the activities that happen there stays invisible, because of course otherwise the system wouldn't be efficient anymore, and also disallow them to be on a powerful relationship with others. Then of course, I mean, I will mention the other ones. In expertise means is very much related to technology, for instance. So is that kind of invisibility of something that you don't understand because you don't have the expertise to be able to understand it. So for instance, digital apparatuses, even the web, for instance, is something that we use but we don't understand it. So who controls the infrastructure, or who controls this kind of field can have a power relationship towards us. Invisibility as an absolute is more related to what is abstract as per definition, so feelings, for instance. So it's all that is concerned, for instance, post-traumatic trauma, or even love. How do you put in a visual sense love? It's highly difficult to really visualize these kind of feelings. And invisibility as a culture is more related with, for instance, social issues and minorities. So for instance, if we take as an example the migration crisis in Europe, so the way communities are kept invisible in order to be exploited. So this is also, again, a power relationship. And so visually you keep a problem or a community invisible in order not to raise any question or any attention on this community. So this is very interesting for me because my work is, yeah, it's documentary, but somehow it's not really showing anything. And I will explain you why. So it's important also to know how did I start it, because it's not that one day I just woke up and I said, okay, I want to really explore the Swiss security system. Actually, I mean, probably all of you know where Switzerland is or what kind of country it is, but just a couple of things, because it's important to understand also the evolution of this culture of security in the country. Basically, Switzerland is a very small country in the center of Europe. And it's, I mean, imagine it's 7 million people living in Switzerland. It's highly, geologically, there are like the Alps, there are so many mountains. And so it's also like, it's an island, basically, in the center of Europe. And of course, I mean, this favored like this kind of the development of a culture that is based on protection and security. Switzerland also historically, for instance, during the war, has always been neutral. So there is like this idea of, I mean, already geologically, there is this idea of being closed, this closeness, and being like need for protection. But basically in 2014, which was when I started basically, there was this federal popular initiative against mass immigration. You need to know that politically Switzerland is, it's interesting. It's an interesting case study because, of course, it's a semi-direct democracy, which means that basically people has a real impact on the course of like the law, the legislation, and the constitution. So basically, there are many. Every year there are many federal popular initiative, which is referendums, basically, where people vote, and then depending if the proposal pass, then in a 3 years period of time has to become law. So actually people has kind of a big power to decide. And sometimes, it's a good thing in general, but sometimes it can also might have some obscure effects. And this was the case for me at this votation. So basically, people were called to vote against mass immigration, which means like stronger, more strict regulations into immigration policies, and it passed. At that time, as Gianni mentioned, I was living in Lugano, which is in the Italian part of Switzerland, in Canton Ticino region, and that was also like the main. One of the highest rate of votes in favor of it was coming from that region. Because I moved to Switzerland when I was 18, so you can imagine my adult life was all there. My affections were there, like everything was there. Today, I even probably feel more attached to Switzerland than to Italy or Sicily, because of course, my life is here. So I took it very bad. I was like, well, at some point I even thought about leaving the country. Also because I couldn't really figure out why in 2014 at that time, we still end up with this stupid epilogues. Of course, this is my point of view. Probably it's not the point of view of the people that voted in favor of it. But to me, it was very stupid. And then, at some point I was like, well, let's put the anger behind, and then let's really do what I know how to do better. And then was like, I wanted to really understand, because to me it was very personal. I had to understand the reasons in order to be able to keep on living in Switzerland. So I started this research. I was talking with people. I was talking with some sociologists even in order to understand it. But at that time, I still didn't think about making a project out of it. Until the day in which I realized that all of my conversation in the end were ending up in this need for security. Everything was sold about security. If you see the communication that the government in Switzerland does, and I think here there are some parallelism with the current government in the States. It's all about security. We need to everything. A stupid anecdote, but that says a lot about Swiss culture is. Some weeks ago, I was walking on a field, and at some point there was like this sign saying, "Don't let your dog poop into the field. Let's keep the field safe." And I was like, "Well, how this is related with safety?" But well, fine. This is really a very, very Swiss way to communicate. Maybe Gianni can also say something about it because he knows very well. So at some point I was like, well, I live in the so-called safest country in the world. Everything is about security. And also the historical moment in which we are living is very particular because, imagine at that time was the highest pitch, for instance, for the migration crisis in Europe. So even the Swiss border were very, very, very under pressure because we had like the Balkan routes and the ones coming from Italy, and there was like a high pressure on the borders. But also, concepts like borders, that is Switzerland, are very common. Everyone talks about borders. In other countries in Europe, like for instance in Italy, I don't remember having had any conversation about borders while I was living there or when I meet my friends there. But in that time, people were like, it was in the news, it was everywhere. And also people started to talk about it. Of course, Switzerland is a particular case study because the main difference is that what is Switzerland, what we are witnessing nowadays with all this populism rising and all this all these fears also after, I mean, in the modern time, after the attacks, the terrorist attacks in New York, for instance, in Switzerland has always been like this. So this culture of protection has always been like this since the beginning of the Swiss history. And then I decided I really wanted to understand what is security, how security is produced, and what a security system is. So I started this work. Of course, I mean, imagine like an Italian guy living in Switzerland trying to assess the security system, because my idea was to really do it from the inside. So I really didn't want to make a journalistic work or an investigation or nothing like that. My approach is analytical. I'm a researcher. I like to work in this way, and I want to understand how the system works rather than giving an opinion on the system. So to me, it was very important to really having access. And the access basically is something very, very hard to gain. Here you can read, if you want, some of my research questions, for instance, at the very beginning. So having access means that I really wanted to work from the inside, and the insider perspective is a privileged perspective, because that means that I would work with the institution that produce security in the country. So I really want them to show me how the system works, what I need to know about the system, and what are the implications that make the system so efficient in the case of Switzerland. So to me, there was really a journey in order to try to understand how to get in. And it took quite a long time. I think that the first access I got after I started was after 1 year, more or less. And it was also a very lucky situation. But yeah, so I had to find a strategy in order to do what I wanted to do. And my strategy was collaboration. I mean, again, here my research, my background as a researcher maybe speaks a bit, but I always like to work in a very collaborative way. So I'm not an artist that likes to work alone. I always like to work with other people that can give me the expertise that I can't achieve by myself. And also because for me it's much more exciting. In this slide, for instance, you see some people that have been very important for without them this project would have been possible. And all of them operate in different ways, of course, but here at this stage I want to mention Jonas Sagman. Basically at the beginning I had to understand the security system. Usually, of course, you might think about police, you might think about civil protection, you might think about the army, but it's much more than that. And at the beginning, I had to understand it. So I was studying, I was reading, but it wasn't enough because, of course, it's much more complex. I will show you something here. So here on the left, for instance, it's in German, but I can translate it. It means like the Swiss security landscape. And basically, this is one of the data visualization that I produced for the project, coming out from a research by Jonas Sagman, and shows, for instance, all the actors that produce security in the country, so actors and agency, and how they collaborate between each other. So you can imagine the complexity of the system if the system itself, the government, assign studies in order to understand what are the connections between the actors that produce security in the country. So that was very important for me to meet Jonas Sagman, because at that time he was researcher at the Center for Security Studies at the University of Zurich. So we got in touch and he opened me the door of the Center for Security Studies. We were supposed to have like one meeting when he could give me some reading suggestion, and then we end up working for basically 5 years together, because he was very, luckily he really enjoyed my idea, and then we end up working together for 5 years. So this, for instance, is a list of the institutions I've been working with for the project. So you can see there are many. Some of them, some of the institutions I wanted to access, I didn't manage to access. So of course, it's not that everything worked out. But I mean, every time I look at this list, I'm quite surprised on how much I managed to achieve, because it's like, wow. At the beginning, I mean, I would put a signature if I would manage to ask maybe half of those. So in the end, I mean, I'm very happy on what I managed to achieve. But of course, it has been a big, long work of trust. Because of course, I mean, security is a lot about trust. And so I had to really understand also how to create trust on me. So sometimes, I mean, it was also quite hard. But at some point, suddenly, I got the first access. And I mean, what?
Can I just stop you there for a second? I actually would like to ask you before, getting to the focal point about, the images and the graphs about that are actually in your project, in the book and the exhibition. You said one important thing right now that, when I read the book, I was really curious about, as a matter of fact, access, and trust that was fundamental in this case. In order to gain that access and achieve those results. You probably were going to mention this probably now, but still I wanted to ask you the question. Do you feel that presenting yourself, I mean, I assume you presented yourself as a researcher and not as a documentary photography, which may lead someone to think that documentary photography is more related to journalism. Do you think that, presenting yourself as, as an academic researcher has helped you to gain that access and trust? And if you just presented yourself as a documentary photographer, it would have been much more difficult?
Never say you are a photographer, like never. not even documentary, like photographer in general, like never say that.
Exactly.
Because you will never ask this, like it's impossible. As soon as you say photography, they start to think news, they start to think, okay, this guy wants to say something bad about us.
Exactly.
Never say photography. No, actually, I wasn't even saying researcher, I was saying artist. Because artists for them is more like, yeah, abstract, yeah, they live in their world, no one cares. And,
yeah, let's get him in, let him play around, let him do his thing, whatever. Yeah.
yeah. No, I was saying I'm an artist, and I'm interested in. No, I mean, of course, when I say about trust, I mean, basically, every time I was assessing an institution, of course, I will have like a first colloquium, like a meeting. I would explain them what I wanted to do, why I wanted to make it. I had to sign a lot of papers, like a lot of declaration and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, non-disclosure, I assume.
Yeah. And I mean, gaining trust, like I was very open and honest with them. So I was really saying, what is my goal, what I want to achieve, and what is going to happen in the end. So at the beginning of the project, I was already saying it's going to be a publication, it's going to be an exhibition, and also something that I was saying, because this is something that I learned, of course, is I have no control on what the press is going to write about it. So keep this in mind, and in case you see something bad in the press, especially in the Swiss press, please don't refer me, because I can send you also the press release, so you will see that I say things as they are, but I don't have that control. And actually I had a problem. I really had a problem with the main newspaper in Switzerland. Basically, they made like a 2 pages, like 2 fully pages article on my work. And the journalist, she wrote a very bad article, in the sense that with Lars Willumeit, who is this guy here, the blonde one, who is a curator and social anthropologist, and been working with him for 2 years. We put the show and the book together. We counted the factual mistakes that were in the article, 16 factual mistakes. But well, it happens, it's fine. I mean, I also like somehow criticism, and I love to read about criticism, because it's also sometimes, it happens to, sometimes also you understand what you made wrong, why not? But in that case, really, it was very wrong. Mm-hmm. But then the police in Zurich contacted me, because I was working with them, they contacted me, and they were very worried of what was written in that article. Because of course, imagine it's the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, it's the main newspaper, it's like New York Times there. So everyone read this piece, and they were very, 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 in a way, mad at me as well. But then, I mean, I was explaining them, listen, I counted all these factual mistakes even in the article. I was like really highlighting these mistakes to them. And yeah, I mean, in the end, they understood also because I created this very open relationship with them. So they understood it. I mean, in the end, everything was solved. But at the beginning, they were very mad because, of course, they say, "What is this bullshit in this piece? It's like we are." I mean, you know, of course, they always see because, yeah, the idea is that, as I say, why it's important to know that my work is analytical? Because, I mean, my final goal wasn't really giving any judgment on the security system. I wasn't giving any judgment on any of the institutions. I never said there is an exceed of security or some policies are wrong or stuff like that. To me, it was more like, listen, this is invisible. This is something that affects our everyday life. I'm going to show you it.
Okay, so on this note, I think that because we've received some messages here in the chat, so because I know the work, but most of the people that are online don't, so maybe we should come to see actually what the work is about in images. So
let's speed up, yes.
Yeah, speed it up a little bit.
finally some images. No, basically, I mean, at the beginning, I was, since I was waiting for this access, I started to really, let's say, to see what I could photograph without depending on any institution. So for instance, in Switzerland, one of the main issues, but one of the main facts is the fact that Switzerland is the third most armed country in the world. Now it's the fourth, because Finland became the third. This is something that is shocking somehow at the first, because you're like, how come? I mean, Switzerland is so peaceful, it's neutral, why there is these weapons? Basically, I mean, of course, the reasons are different than in countries like the States. Basically, here is because the army is still mandatory. So people have to go 2 weeks, more or less 2 weeks every year to the army and to play as soldiers. So I really wanted to photograph this. And the way I did was like, I asked a friend of mine who is a normal guy, he's an artist basically, and he has to go to the army. So I was like, can we re-enhance the official instruction manual of the Swiss assault rifle? Imagine the Swiss assault rifle is like AK-47, the Kalashnikov, very similar. And this is something that you see everywhere. Like you're in the train and you see this gun somewhere there. You are at the McDonald's and you see these rifles there, because everyone got it. Because basically what happens is that people go to the army, they do their training, and then they bring it at home. So this is the reason why there are so many weapons around in Switzerland. And also for me, it was so simple to find this rifle, and it's my friend's rifle, basically, and to photograph it. And also another reason is because firing with guns is a national sport here. So many people do it, even children. There is a very beautiful, I suggest you to have a look if you're interested in it, very beautiful documentary by Al Jazeera International. You can find it on YouTube, and it's called Guns in Switzerland. And it's crazy because you can see images of little child, like 10 years old, that they know exactly how to demount, clean, and fire with this rifle. So, I mean, it's very strong. Then, of course, if we speak about, for instance, murdering rate for guns in Switzerland is super low, it's 3%. So basically there is no murdering. But for instance, suicide rates are quite high. Because of course, every country has its issues, and here, for instance, people have a very, very defined, a big civil sense. So, I mean, also the crime here is not so present, I would say. But at the same time, there are many social issues that led people, for instance, to be depressed or to have like this kind of problems. So statistics are good, but they have to be read. So saying is the third most armed country in the world, of course, is shocking, but then you have to read the numbers. Otherwise, you might have that's what I mean when I say that I work with data. Because, I mean, to me, it's not giving any judgment. It's like, this is the data, and then you have to interpret it. But then, let's go to the first access I got. So actually, for a very lucky situation, I had the first access with the border police. The border police is very interesting because it's one together. I mean, Switzerland is a federal country, so of course a lot of power is delegated to cantons. Cantoni. I don't know if you have this word in English. It's like states.
Yeah, states maybe.
Yeah, states. Yeah. So there are only two, basically, two institutions, two corpses that are national, and it's the army and the border police. So to me, it was also a very interesting training working with them because they deal with so many different issues. So migration, drug, money, smuggling, like goods, even like they stop you when you go to do your grocery in Italy and you buy too much meat when you go back, because we go and buy, and like when I was living in Lugano, I was crossing the border just to grocery because it's much cheaper, and then you go back. So they do several things. And for me, there was an amazing training, because then for the first time I was inside the system, I'm like, wow. And it happened just because at some point, Jonas Sagman, this famous scholar I was mentioning, he basically found out that a former classmate of him in the secondary school, high school, I don't remember, became the chief of the border guards in Basel, in the German border. So we contacted him, and suddenly, after 1 year, I had the access. So in the end, I mean, you can be speculous as much as you want, but word of mouth is the most powerful tool in this case. But then I accessed it. So I was at the border. I've been covering many of the activities they did. In these images, you see several things like cells when they put people that they stop, migration control. At that time also was an amazing, like, as I said, very pressured in the border. At some point, because of this, the journalists, there were like some debates about the fact that they were selling back minors, and this is illegal. So at some point, the government closed the access to every journalist, every photographer at the border. And at some point, I found myself to be the only one to be there photographing, of course, for other people, for other purposes. But I mean, I was kind of privileged in this. I remember some friends of mine were hating me because they wanted to come to Switzerland, because we had a little Calais in Como. So they wanted to come there and photograph, and they weren't allowed. And I was there photographing, but I wasn't really focusing on migration because that was not my topic. Basically, this is the only image in the project that tells you something about migration. And maybe this one, because this was like, they were trying to explain to people that Switzerland has 4 languages. So you have French part, German part, and Italian part. So when you cross the border, for instance, from Italy, you don't even understand you're crossing the border sometimes. And this image for me was very interesting because, I mean, as you can see, they were explaining, you are here, this is Zurich. If you want to go to Germany, just go from Austria, don't cross Switzerland, you're not allowed. So, I mean, this says a lot about also Switzerland. But well, of course, I mean, for me, it was also interesting to understand what a border is in the end, because a border, I mean, unless you don't have a big wall, and we don't have it in Switzerland, luckily, it's just nothing. It's just forest. It's just images like this. This is like, for instance, on the left you see an image of a tree and a river. Like, this is a border. There is nothing, not even signature. On the right you see night vision images of the border, which is basically nature mostly. At some point, the border police was using a drone to catch the migrants crossing illegally. And this drone, of course, was during night you could hear it, like, and there were like also many polemics about it. But then also, I mean, a security system is made of police, for instance. I mean, also the police, it took some time, but you know, as soon as you have the first access, then it's easier. Not easy. I'm not saying easy, but slowly I made my way into the system. So I was very interested, for instance, in photographing. Also, the police does many activities. But as you might already, you saw some images already, you can understand my approach is not really, I'm not showing anything. There is no action. There is no, my approach is very clinical. Because I mean, at the beginning, I've been thinking a lot on how to photograph all of this. How can I really photograph something that is so elusive, and at the same time, I will be facing so many different situations, so many different places. I have no control because, of course, imagine every time I was going to shoot, I had, you wait for 6 months maybe, and then you go, you have 1 hour, 2 hours, someone always following you saying, you can photograph this, you can't photograph that. I can't bring so much gear with me. So, I mean, I really had to think a lot about my visual strategy. And I was like, well, my work is analytical, so let's use an analytical approach. And it's kind of Swiss in a way. I also wasn't really interested in photographing people. This is one of the few portraits. You never even see the faces of my subjects.
Can I ask you a question, Salvatore? Can I ask
you a question?
Yes,
sure.
So you were saying that you started out with research before you started to take pictures. Did you create some kind of almost maybe like a storyboard? How did you figure out what you want to photograph? Did you know beforehand exactly what image you wanted to get, or was it more that you knew where you wanted to go and then you would photograph whatever you would see there?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was impossible to know in advance what kind of images I wanted to get because, I mean, in some cases, like, for instance, when I showed the instruction manual, re-enhancement, then yes, of course, I had full control of what I was doing. Also, for instance, the still life, I had full control of what I was doing. But in many cases, I hadn't. Because the problem, imagine like every time I was getting it, like the police, I meet the spokesperson and then I say, I mean, thanks to my research, I knew exactly what I wanted. So I was asking them, can you show me this? Can you bring me there, etc., etc. So I really had to be creative in the sense that, I mean, of course, I knew what I was interested in. So I knew that, for instance, I wanted to photograph control rooms. So like this image. And I had a specific idea on how I wanted to photograph a control room. So in the project, there are several control rooms because this
so
is
you had to go there when nobody was there. You had to plan it so you would get access when nobody was there. Is that how you did it?
No. It was impossible. I had to go there when they would. I mean, I was good at finding the right moment probably because here actually there were people around.
Yeah, I mean, it almost looks like a still life. It's really amazing.
One thing I wanted to tell you, Salvatore, you know, what I think is really interesting and fascinating, I mean, from my perspective as a photographer, as a documentary photographer, is that I can tell there is this desire in you to that comes from, I think, like a background in documentary photography, but that the tools that you had were, I mean, the access that you had was kind of limited. And in fact, the images, if you look at these images one by one, as you said, there is absolutely no action. I mean, they look, even landscapes look like, you know, still lives. So there isn't any action in the single images. There isn't any narrative in the single images. But as a whole, when you look at these pictures, one next to the other, especially in the book or even in this presentation, there is, you know, a underlying, I'm not gonna say message, but feeling, you know, that there's a power structure that is, you know, invisible. So can you, is that something that you're aware about, you know, since the very beginning, that, you know, you were not looking into the sensationalism of a single image, but, you know, as a body of work? You know, there are images, especially if you look at photojournalism or in documentary photography, in publications, you know, there's the opening picture where, you know, that one image just, you know, sets the scene, you know, for the story. And in here, in this project, there isn't any image that actually, you know, sets the scene, because there's not narrative in single images, but, you know, it is the body of work and the, you know, the way the viewer in the book or in the exhibition perceives the work you've done.
Well, to me, I mean, my approach to visual images, visuals, because I mean, I think that this also is something that I apply when I work with media that are not necessarily photography. It's always like I work on I like to create a mood, an atmosphere, which plays, I play a lot on this layer of representation and experience. So I ask also my viewers to really put themselves into the work in order to experience it, also using their personal experience. So when I was producing those images, I knew that my main aim was like, I don't care about the single image. I don't need to create any narrative in the single image, because the single image is not what matters. What matters is that the viewer in the end will feel overwhelmed in a way, and this is also a technique I use to exhibit the work, will feel overwhelmed by, for the first time, being facing what usually is not allowed to be seen. So exactly. To me, it was more like really creating this atmosphere. I mean, in the images, I think you can, especially when you see them together, you can kind of sense this tension, this kind of, you know, it's nothing happens, but there is this feeling that something might happen. And this is also a reflection on how we live in Switzerland, because Switzerland, this culture of security brings this idea that something has to happen all the time. So you will really live in this kind of anxiety that from one moment to another, something will happen. And this was this kind of feeling that I'm living in my everyday life that I wanted to bring into the project. Also,
I look at these images, and the feeling that I have from these images, I think is the same exact feeling and experience that I have every time that I'm at the border of Switzerland, either crossing by train or when I'm driving into the border of Switzerland. And even when you're in the country, I mean, that is that underlying feeling of exactly anxiety, even though, you know, it presents itself as one of the most beautiful countries on earth because of its lakes, its forests, and its Alps. There is that, you know, constant tension, you know. So
yeah, exactly.
And I do feel that, you know, these images as a whole, they might seem but if you pick them one by one, they might seem, you know, genuine. When you start, you know, putting them together, I start to freak out.
That's interesting, because I mean, that was what I wanted people to experience somehow. For instance, I mean, what is interesting to know about Switzerland is that not only Switzerland, but Switzerland is the main case study of this. It's all based on simulations. So basically, also with the pandemic, and maybe we go on something that is happening now. The interesting thing for me was at some point when the pandemic happened, I was following the government moves, and I knew everything on what they were gonna do, because basically in Switzerland, they have like this risk management system. There are like risks that they are categorized in 3 different categories: social, technological, and natural. Pandemic is a social risk, and then you have like these studies and protocols and simulation they make. Like they invest a lot of money doing these simulations, and so basically, knowing, I was studying, of course, these protocols. Knowing the protocol, I knew exactly what was going to happen. And I have to say that also the simulation they're making goes so, like in the case of a pandemic, it was so close to reality, to what really happened. And they published this study in 2005, so 15 years ago. So this is also what makes the system so efficient. For instance, this image, this is why I stopped here. This image, for instance, shows a military training camp. They are very common in Switzerland, but here they can simulate any kind of thing, basically any kind of event. And they use them also to train robots. So there is an ongoing collaboration with the universities in Switzerland, and they train robots in order to perform seek and rescue missions. And this is something that I photographed also in my project. And I wish maybe I will go a little bit faster. Because of course, the security system is not made only of the police and the army. It's made also of technology. So for instance, I've been exploring cybersecurity. I've been working with the Swiss intelligence department that deals with cybersecurity, cyber threats. So I started to work with sound installation and video installation. If there is time or you want to see something, I can show you something later. But then it's made of this beautiful infrastructure also. The Swiss Alps are like Swiss cheese in a way, because they are they are crowded. They are completely, like, there are so many bunkers, hidden bunkers. For instance, on the right here you see a chalet, very common Swiss image, but it's a bunker. Or an image like this, like beautiful Swiss landscape. Actually, there are so many weapons and bunkers hidden there.
So that is one question that we had in the chat, actually. So how do you actually pair images one next to each other? So how do the images talk to each other? For instance, like in the previous picture, the one of the chalet. So the chalet that we see on the right is how does the chalet on the right relate to the image on the left, which is an entrance to a bunker? So how did you decide to put these two images together?
Well, in this case, for the presentation, it was not very conscious. I mean, I think that they were just visually looking very well together, and I put them together. But when I create my narrative, especially for the book, so basically, when I pair images, well, this is an interesting question, because of course there is a visual aspect that plays in it, but my images have not a hierarchy. So if you see, for instance, in the structure of the book, the black ones, the black pages are the images. If you see, they are all the same size. So I didn't want to play, for instance, with any size on the page, because for me, there is not an image that is more important rather than the other image. So for me, it's very much about, there is no hierarchy. It's very much about, first of all, a conceptual background, so what the image represents in the specific part of the book, and how it relates with the next image, in the sense that both in terms of storytelling. So for instance, I'm showing I don't remember, like that image I had with the portrait. Next to it, there were sensors, some sensor screens. So in that case, in order to go concrete, in that case, for instance, there is like this private company agent, because a lot, I mean, in Switzerland, a lot is commissioned to private security services, which of course create a lot of debates about the use of data they collect, etc., etc. And then you have this sensor screen. The sensor screen come from the police, and I had to censor them, but to be relate, because of course there I speak about the problem between public-private security and the censorship that is applied to, for instance, sensitive information. So I create this kind of micro-narrative in the pages following my image. So a part is visual, definitely, visual narrative, of course, but also it's really relates with the subject matter. For instance, if you see here these two images together, they also come from different, they are not shot in the same day, in the same location, but to me they work very well, because the image on the left represents, I mean, it's like a ceremony of the military protocol. So for instance, when I approached the army, I didn't want to show the tanks, the war. I wanted to show, like, because the security policies shifted in the last 20 years from militarization to diplomatic mission, for instance, to peacekeeping, etc., etc. So that was what interested me about the army. And I went to photograph this ceremony. It was super hard because I think, if I'm not wrong, I was the first civil photographer allowed to photograph this ceremony. And I was in Moscow. After months I was trying, I was in Moscow. They called me and they were like, if you want, you can come to Bern tomorrow or never. I had to fly to Bern from Moscow last minute, but like I managed. But to me, that picture, these two images work very well, because in a way, I like this abstractness of the left image, where also you can define the role of the women. I mean, there is much more in the picture than what you see. And the right, which is a gaze, is a detail of a gaze during a simulation of a terrorist attack at the border. So to me, these two images will create this very interesting tension, both visually and in terms of, because then, I mean, at the end, you always have the captions at the end of each cluster. So you can see exactly what it is. So you have this information, not in the page of the image, because I wanted to give space to the image, but you have the information, so you can make this kind of connection between the images and the way I show them.
Salvatore, I don't know if you know that
Yes?
Ellen. I don't know if you know that Ellen Frame is here. Gianni, I was wondering
no.
if you could read the question from Ellen. There's Ellen.
Yeah, hi Salvador. I'm really
Hi Alan, so nice to hear from you.
yeah, thanks for the shout out, and I'm super impressed by your persistence and commitment to this project, and it seems so thorough, so well researched, and so consistent in its presentation, even though you know incorporate various genres of pictures, from a kind of landscape to a kind of portrait, even though they're from the back, to still life. But there's a very sort of consistent, I guess you're calling it an analytical approach. Sometimes it feels particularly sculptural, I guess, because there's so many objects, but even when you photograph the people, you like really have a strong sense of their form. But with all of that research and compilation and getting into that project deeply with so much support from your fellow researchers, how did you decide when you were finished, or do you think you're finished, or finished enough to do this book?
That's a very good question, because actually I didn't decide it was finished, you know. So no, what happened is that basically I was lucky in a sense that at some point while I was working on it, I had the Swiss Foundation for Photography approached me and asked me to make a show. So to have a solo show where I would present the whole project for the first time. So it was a premiere show. And they proposed me 2 years' time since the proposal. So that for me was good in the sense that for the first time I had a deadline. I was like, okay, I want to do it. I have 2 years. I have still a lot to do, but this helps me to understand where can I get in 2 years and to complete it somehow. So I did it. This image I'm showing now is from that exhibition. So I did it, and somehow I managed to close it. Because at some point, I had a list of institutions I wanted to photograph. I had a list of places, institutions that to me were very important. Some of them didn't work out. So for instance, the power plants, the nuclear power plants, I couldn't get in because of security measures, for instance. But I was happy enough with all that I had.
I saw on your website, and I think you're showing it now, that each time you show this project in a different gallery, in a different space, you have to adjust it a little bit. And the rooms that you have exhibited in are often very different from each other. How do you deal with that? Could you just briefly, we need to wrap it up soon, by the way, I just wanted to know that. But could you briefly talk about, just for the listeners, to get an idea of what they could consider when they have to exhibit in different spaces, and how you adjust the project for each space?
Well, to me, exhibition making actually is one of the most exciting parts. To me, it's like adding sense. And sometimes, in order also to connect with Alan and Bastian, they are a very good way for me to add things that maybe I didn't cover in the book or I didn't cover somewhere else. So I like to work site-specific. This means that I really work in the space. So I don't have like a definite layout that I make travel or I use in different spaces. But every space has a different story. And I also work a lot in a very installative way. So for instance, there is a big difference, as you can see, between this installation that was in China and this one. Because for me, exhibition is really mediation in a way. So to me, it's like taking my project, trying to find, to get in touch also with the context in which I'm showing it. So even the country where I'm showing it. And then using the physicality of the space in order to give the best vision possible. So for instance, in this case, in winter tour, I had the full museum. I had a lot of space, so I could really do, that was the best case scenario for me. You know, I could do whatever I wanted, I had enough space. But sometimes you find yourself with a smaller space. And how can you show all of this research in a smaller space? So I like to play with strategies that allow me to bring in the content I want, even without having like enormous amount of space. So for instance, in this case, I adopted this installative strategy where I created this, the room was rounded, so I really like to play in this circle. So I created this structure that is basically the shape of a panopticon. A panopticon, for the ones who doesn't know, is this way of building up, designing a prison where there is like a central tower and the prison is all built around it, so one person can surveil basically all the prison. So I created this panopticon structure where there is like this trolley LED, which is very used in China. That's why I also kind of appropriated of this kind of language, and also this kind of trolling signs are used massively in the security system, where there were like these keywords referring to the project, so the structure of the project, and there was an audio sound installation double channel, again referring to the institution producing security, Switzerland, and all around the world the images. Then, I mean, the sad side of it is that this exhibition has been censored massively in China. So half of the show was put out down of the wall, but this is another story. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, so I really want, in this case, for instance, I really wanted to have this physicality because it was the first time, the sense of feeling overwhelmed I was talking about. So you really had to go through the images, and the images were printed very big on the floor. So the structure on the left, for instance, was the highest one, and is 1.80 meters high. So it's like very physical impact with the images as well. And also I switched. So now usually in the museum, the wall is the place for photography, it's like the Aulic place. And then actually I put data on the wall and not images.
Interesting.
So I was, because for me, data has the same, data visualizations has the same, exact the same importance as my images. So I can make this difference. Not, data are not supporting, they are not functioning as captions. They are really like, they are images themselves, piece of art themselves.
I have one question, since I don't see any other questions coming up in the chat, unless someone has. But so Salvatore, the launch pad, let's say, for the start of this project was the referendum in 2014, and your condition, you know, as an immigrant in Switzerland, but who had basically built his entire adulthood for the previous 10 years in a new country. So you kind of, I guess you kind of felt Swiss, or you felt Swiss and Italian at the same time. But the referendum was the turning point for you to start wanting to understand what country you were living in. So I think that, you know, that vantage point that you had was, I think, absolutely helped you to build this project. I don't know if a Swiss native could have done that because I think you had the right distance to approach this subject. But my question is, once the book came out, and once the exhibition came out, and once after the book came out, how do you think the Swiss who had actually voted for that, you know, law against mass immigration, how did they perceive this project from the exhibitions, at least? I mean, did you get into any kind of conversations? You know, did people tell you that, you know, this project had opened their eyes? I'm curious of how Swiss people actually perceived your work.
Yeah, to me that was important, for instance, to have the first exhibition about the work in, like, the total work in Switzerland, because of course, I mean, to me it was also a way to, I mean, my audience in the end, one of the main audience for Swiss people, in order to get everything start from there, even though of course I've been presenting the work before in Japan, in China, in Germany, in many different countries. but Switzerland for me was special, definitely. Actually, I mean, it was interesting because on a side, I had very positive comments from people that were like during the show, especially, they were telling me, oh, there are so many things I don't know about my country, actually. So I need to really study much more, research more in order to understand many things that also because I have a responsibility on this kind of things because I'm called to vote basically every 2 months. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting for me. Also, the exhibition, for example, has been visited a lot massively by people working in social fields, for instance. So at some point, I had a guided tour with 80 people working with migrants. So that was super positive, definitely. Also, in the art world, was quite well received in a way. But I have to say that I also had very negative. That was interviewing me for the opening of the exhibition. And then at some point, he was talking with the director of the museum in German, but I could understand, luckily. And also my friend also was telling me that I was right. Basically was saying, oh, he's Italian. How he can dare to talk about Switzerland like this?
Of course.
and this is a comment that it was not the first time. So some people really didn't really like the fact that I'm Italian, even though you are totally right that if I would be Swiss, I will never be able to do it like this at all, because I mean, you don't have, I mean, sometimes you really need to be external in order to see things. If you are too immersed, then many things appear invisible. But I mean, it's fine. I don't mind. I like this kind of comments as well, because then I can argue, well, I'm probably more Swiss than you, because after this project, I really know probably much more about Switzerland than many Swiss people.
Yeah.
So yeah, in the end, I mean, it's provocation, but I like provocation, so why not?
Yeah, I mean, I'm Swiss. I have Swiss citizenship, as you know. I mean, my mother is Swiss. I grew up in Switzerland, and I haven't lived there enough. I've lived there only 8 years of my life. But I mean, I can relate to these images because that the feeling I have by looking at your work is, as I said before, is the same feeling when I'm actually in Switzerland. Especially when I started going back, visiting the country after I moved out when I was a teenager. But, you know, I've discovered things thanks to your work that, you know, even if you're Italian, Sicilian, you explained and presented, you know, even to Swiss natives. I mean, as I said, you know, I'm Swiss, and I didn't know anything about this.
Salvatore, did you already mention where we can get the book?
Well, the book, actually, I mean, I think that also you might find it in many bookshops in the States,
okay,
because it's distributed also in the States. Otherwise, on the publisher website, which is Lars Müller Publishers, okay, there for sure, but it's distributed in the US. So
okay, very good. Stefan, did you have a question? Somehow I thought I heard you for 1 second.
Yes, I just wanted to mention.
Last question. Yeah,
I just wanted to mention that I do not think that this is especially a Swiss project. At least it is not to me. The way you photographed it is very cool and distant and detached and technocratic, and this is very. This has features of almost all security systems around the world, and about the way these security systems work. They are very much attached, and they are, as you said, you started out with a democratic movement and ended up with something that is per se very undemocratic. Because these security systems are never controlled, you don't have any democratic access to it. And this is not very specific to Swiss, I think. Currently, it's very specific to Europe. So the way it's not only Swiss that builds a fortress around itself. I still think it's even in Europe where we try to build a fortress around it. So this is why I think it's very general.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
Switzerland is the case study, but it doesn't definitely apply to many other countries, I guess.
I think it's like a laboratory because it's so small. So you get the cause and effect. It's really strictly related because everything is so small. But I think it happens everywhere. So we have a similar movement here with the AfD in Germany here. So we have similar movements here with similar results in the security systems.
Yeah, so, definitely. I mean, to me, actually, I mean, the project is really not about Switzerland. Switzerland, of course, is the playground where I've been witnessing all of that I show. But actually, many things that happen in Switzerland happen even discourses, not just the functioning of the system, happens in many other countries. And for me, for instance, it was always interesting to present it in several contexts. So for instance, when I was presenting it in Japan, people could really understand what I was talking about, because their kind of civil sense and their culture, security culture, is very similar to the Swiss one. But when I was presenting the work in France, it was totally different. For instance, so in Nepal was, you can imagine. So, you know, to me, it's always like very interesting to see also the reactions, because you can trace many similarities, but also many differences in the way things are done. And also what is interesting about Switzerland is that maybe also because the country is so small and not so many people know a lot about what's going on here. And this is a political decision to hide a lot of what is going on here. It's like selling this idea of the cliche of the country.
Does anybody else have a question for Salvatore?
Not a question, but earlier you had asked about the makeup of your audience here. And we had people from Istanbul, Mexico City, France, Florida, Switzerland, an Italian in Mexico, a Mexican in the Bronx, people from New York, Germany, Italy, Barbados, New Orleans, Venezuela, and other places.
All right, Edward, thanks
for
sharing.
Wow, that's amazing.
Salvatore, thank you so much. I feel like we all learned a lot. This was really informative. How to visualize things and about data visualization. And I love what you were talking about, that you put the data visualization on the wall and the photos were in the space. And that you do all of your research first and photos come later. This was all really exciting. So thank you so much for sharing all that information with us. And Gianni, thank you so much for hosting.
No, thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad, Salvatore was able to, present his work. I think it was totally worth it. I mean, this really deserves.
Thank you. And if you want to know, if you want to know more, of course, feel free to reach out. There is my email, Instagram, website, whatever. I'm happy always to engage with people. So.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here, and I hope to see you next week.